Look at the events you've written down. Is it real to you that the conclusion you reached, I'm a failure, is a valid interpretation of those events? Can you agree that virtually any child at that age and in those situations would have reached a similar conclusion? Now we're going to play the possibilities game. We'll imagine that 4 of your friends are visiting you and looking at a videotape of the events you just wrote down. Your interpretation of those events when you were a child was, I'm a failure. That is one valid interpretation of Mom and Dad's behavior. That interpretation wasn't wrong, but there are other reasonable interpretations of the same childhood events that you didn't think of as a child. So let's ask each of your friends for another alternative interpretation. Can you see that one friend might well say, you may have failed many times, but that doesn't mean you're a failure. Successful people fail all the time. Couldn't you may have failed many times, but that doesn't make you a failure? Explain those events in your childhood just as well as your interpretation that I'm a failure? Remember, all successful people say that failures are the key to success. Maybe your parents didn't understand that failing is the best way to learn. Richard Branson, the multi-billionaire who created Virgin Airlines and the many other Virgin companies, says he fails all the time. And if you don't fail, you'll be mediocre. Here's what your second friend says. Maybe your parents reacted that way because they believed you were a failure when you didn't do what they wanted. That doesn't mean you were a failure. Doesn't this interpretation also explain those events in your childhood just as well as your interpretation, I'm a failure? Here's a third possible interpretation of your childhood events that one of your friends suggests. How about this? Your parents reacted that way because they didn't know how to say, I'm disappointed in what you did. I'm not disappointed in you. It didn't mean you were a failure. They were just disappointed in what you did. Doesn't this interpretation also explain those events in your childhood just as well as your interpretation, I'm a failure? Your childhood interactions with your parents could have lots of meanings. Here's one your fourth friend suggests. Your parents' reaction to you had nothing to do with what kind of person you were. Their reaction was a function of their own beliefs and circumstances at the time. Couldn't any one of these interpretations explain your childhood interactions with your parents just as well as your interpretation, I'm a failure? Of course they can. So is it real to you that a belief you've lived with almost your entire life, something you thought was a fact, is not a fact? It isn't even the truth at all. It's only a truth, merely one interpretation of many possible interpretations of earlier events. Right? Please continue to interact totally with this program in order for it to work. And that includes answering my questions out loud, even if your answer is only yes or no. So, let me repeat the question. Is it real that I'm a failure is not a fact? It is not the truth, but just a truth. It is just one interpretation of many possible interpretations of earlier childhood events. I bet you do now. With a little help from me and your friends, you can see that the earlier events associated with your parents' annoyance when you didn't do what they wanted, how they wanted, or when they were disappointed in you, have at least 4 different reasonable interpretations or meanings. Do you remember what you wrote down a few minutes ago as the source of your belief, I'm a failure? Look at the text box below on your screen. Right now, Imagine seeing what you saw then and hearing what you heard then. Now, take a few minutes and really imagine the events of your childhood that led you to form the belief, I'm a failure. Didn't it seem, when you were a child, as if you could actually see, I'm a failure? Like you could point to it in those early events with your parents. It did, didn't it? You may have the sense that you didn't see the belief. You felt it. Once you formed the belief, I'm a failure, you probably did feel it. I'll get back to that feeling in a moment. But what I'd like you to focus on now is not the feeling, but on my question. Didn't it seem as if you saw, I'm a failure, as if you could point to it, as if you could have said to me, see, Shelley, can't you see I'm a failure? I didn't hear you. Did you say yes? Remember what I explained when you were eliminating the earlier beliefs? What happened was that you looked at events that could have had many different meanings and chose one, which any kid would have chosen, which in this case was, I'm a failure. By attributing that specific meaning to the events, each time you saw Mom and Dad's behavior, it was as if you could see that meaning in their behavior. But you didn't discover the meaning in the events. You attributed the meaning to the events. They had no meaning before you gave them one. Now that you think you saw I'm a failure as a child, I'd like you to look again. Did you ever really see I'm a failure? Could you really point to it? Does I'm a failure have a color, a shape, a location? Is it real to you now that you saw events, but you never saw I'm a failure? If anything you can really see can be described, and if you can't describe what I'm a failure looks like, is it clear now that you never really saw it? Since you never really saw I'm a failure, what did you actually see? Take a moment and actually answer out loud what you saw specifically. Is it clear now all you really saw was the reaction of one or both of your parents when you did something they weren't happy about, and you noticed you felt like a failure? In other words, all you really saw was a series of events. You see, what happened was that you looked at a series of events that can be interpreted in many ways. You gave the events one meaning, which was, I'm a failure. By attributing that specific meaning to the events, each time you saw Mom and Dad's behavior, it was as if you could see that meaning in their behavior. But you didn't discover the meaning in the events. You attributed that meaning to the events. They had no meaning before you gave them one. Is it real now that the events had no meaning until you attributed one to them? Here's another way to understand that events have no inherent meaning. When I'm saying that, I'm saying you don't know anything for sure about you, about people, or about life as a result of these experiences. What do I know for sure about you from knowing about how your parents treated you when you were a child? Is it clear that I wouldn't know anything? And if I don't know anything, you don't either. All you know for sure is what actually happened. Your mom and dad sounded annoyed or angry and perhaps punished you when you didn't do what they wanted you to do, when they wanted you to do it, and you felt like a failure. And finally, if you never saw "I'm a failure" out there in the world, where has it been all these years? Did I hear you say that "I'm a failure" has only ever existed in your mind? That you never did see it out there in the world? That's right. If the belief is more real to you as a feeling than as a concept, here's another way to look at it. Didn't it seem as if your parents' behavior and comments when you were a child made you feel that "I'm a failure"? It did, didn't it? But you just agreed that the events have no meaning. Is it possible for events that have no meaning to make you feel "I'm a failure," or anything else for that matter? Of course not. Remember, if an event has no meaning, it can't make you feel anything. So if mom and dad's behavior couldn't have made you feel "I'm a failure," what did make you feel that? By now, I think you know the answer to that question. Please answer out loud. That's right. You felt that only because that's the meaning you had already given to your parents' behavior. Let me help you make this real. Imagine that I had been there when you were a little child, and I had shown you the alternative interpretations for your parents' behavior. And after that conversation, you concluded, "My parents are having unreasonable expectations of me. Their annoyance has nothing to do with whether I'm a failure or not." Here's what I'd like you to do now. Take a moment and really imagine being a child, and mom and dad get annoyed at you again for something you did or didn't do. As you imagine the events, apply this different interpretation to their behavior. Notice how it feels to be a child who's thinking, "My parents have unreasonable expectations of me. That's why they get annoyed, not because I'm a failure." You can use the pause button below to pause the video while you make this childhood scenario more real for yourself. When you're done imagining, press the play button. As you imagine this scene, does it still feel like your parents' words and actions are making you feel, "I'm a failure"? Probably not. And if you didn't feel "I'm a failure" then, would you feel it now? Again, the answer is no. So mom and dad's behavior never caused you to feel "I'm a failure." That feeling came from your interpretation of their behavior. And since your feelings were never caused by events in reality, they were only the result of the meaning you made up to explain the events, is it real that the feelings you had when your parents were annoyed or angry didn't tell you anything at all about whether or not you were a failure? They didn't, did they? Okay, now take a deep breath. Let it out slowly. And then say out loud, "I'm a failure." Is it the truth? Doesn't it feel a little different now? Does it still feel like the truth? Your answer is very important here. Don't forget that we form beliefs to give meaning to the events that have no real meaning. Having done that, we then think we observe the meaning in the events out there in the world. It becomes a fact for us. Once we realize that the earlier events never had any real meaning, that the meaning was only in our mind, that it was never a fact, that the feeling was caused by the meaning we gave meaningless events, the belief disappears forever. Okay, take another deep breath and say, I'm a failure, out loud. I'll bet it feels very different when you say these words now than when you said them at the beginning of this exercise. Do these words feel true even a little bit? Unless the belief is 100% gone and the words don't feel true at all, you probably still have the belief. Remember, holding a belief is like being pregnant. You either is or you ain't. There's no sort of. If the belief is still there, it probably still seems like you saw it. Once it no longer seems as if you saw I'm a failure in those early events, the belief will be gone. So please click the repeat button to repeat that step of the process if it feels like you still have the belief. If the belief is gone, please click continue.